Steel Wheel Security by Kip Hawley. We spend so much time thinking and talking about aviation security. It clearly holds a key place within the national risk hierarchy. But as critical as the aviation network is for the United States, the rail network is an equally vital part of national life. So how should we consider managing risk in the freight rail sector? First, it is necessary to understand the size and scale of the freight rail network. Existing almost entirely outdoors, it consists of over 100,000 miles of rail track and over 1 million rail cars across the country. Freight railroads gross over $50 billion in revenue annually, $20 billion of which is reinvested in maintaining, improving, and protecting the system. The rail network is also critical to the country's security. The U.S. Department of Defense has designated more than 38,000 miles of rail as essential to national defense, and railroads moved 98% of the ammunition used by the U.S. during the Iraq War. Railroads also move about 2 million hazmat shipments a year. Clearly, from a counterterrorism perspective, it is a large target. So how do we go about securing a transportation sector of this magnitude? The sheer size and scope of it renders some normal methods of security measures, such as fencing, impractical and ineffective. Each top railroad company nets over $1 billion every year. With billions of dollars worth of track scattered strategically across the United States, and million-dollar locomotives pulling 1 million cars with 2 million shipments of hazardous materials, railroad companies exist in a world of big numbers. For the past 100 years, these companies have operated according to the following principle. More trains running more smoothly equals more money. The infrastructure supporting these systems were developed to support this central principle of money-making. All major railroads have sophisticated communication systems connecting the locomotive crew and the dispatch system. These systems allow railroad headquarters to know, in real time, precisely where the train is at any moment. In some cases, railroad dispatchers can practically operate the train from the operations center remotely. Based on these facts, one might argue that railroads exercise better communications between the dispatch and train than that which exists between an airline and air traffic controller. It is no coincidence that the very things we think of as security disasters can also be simultaneously public health, safety, and traffic flow disasters. Any one of these in isolation could cost millions of dollars. Taken together, the impact could be overwhelming. Forget for a moment about security breaches and their potential impact. What else has the effect of bringing the rail network to a halt? Railroads will try almost any preventative measure in order to avoid a prolonged rail stoppage. As we have already established, railroads have comprised one of the most profitable and stable businesses in America for the past 100 years. But one potential threat to this stability is a major toxic waste spill. Railroads are obsessed with this potential disaster. In any area that a train passes through with hazardous material, measures are taken to ensure that the track is sound and secure. Additionally, only cars in good repair, ones that can withstand derailing and puncturing, are used. Other less likely risks are considered, such as damage that could be caused by stray bullets from hunters. For decades, all of these risks have been taken into account by the railroads themselves and their safety regulator, the Federal Rail Administration, FRA, hardening the security system long before TSA came into the picture. Over thousands of miles long, the railroad is subject to regulation and oversight by states, counties, cities, towns, and highway departments. Relationships with first responders, fire, police, and hazmat cleanup, are vital. There has been a robust local effort to reroute trains carrying hazardous materials particularly toxic chemicals, away from urban areas. In order to avoid total disruption to the route structure, railroads have actively fought this endeavor. From a safety perspective, this issue is actually more complex than it may at first seem. Rerouting these shipments would involve moving from the safest routes, specifically designed to support toxic chemical freight, to less maintained, less hardened sections of railroad. Not only are the interests of many levels of government and regulatory entities at stake in these kinds of issues, there is also a great deal of local and private involvement as well. Environmental matters are becoming increasingly vital, and there are always local safety concerns to consider: street crossings, whistles blowing too loudly or not loudly enough, and so forth. Over time, railroad companies have thickened their skin when dealing with all of the would-be regulators in their business. Clearly, their intrusion is not always embraced. Across the globe, railroads present one of the top potential and actual terrorist targets. They are easily visible and provide an easy target for a bomb. They are vulnerable to chemical attack, for example, a chlorine leak. An underlying rail can be destroyed, leading to derailment or wreck. The cars themselves are susceptible to high-powered rounds shot from a distance, and bridge sections can be weakened or blown up completely. The impact of a railroad attack can be costly financially, environmentally, and most importantly, in terms of human life. Let's begin looking at railroad security by contrasting two distinct approaches to securing the biggest threat involving freight rail: hazardous material transported via railroad. If a terrorist could manage to release this material into the environment, it could cause significant casualties in urban areas, not to mention untold environmental damage. The first approach we will discuss is called rail rule, and it works by imposing security regulations onto the railway system. The second approach, which utilizes security action items, is, in contrast to the first, voluntary and works within the existing framework of the railway system. As we outline these two different strategies, consider them critically, determining which you believe is the superior method and why. Proposed measure number 1 is a formalized rail rule. This proposal has 5 parts and deals with poisonous inhalation hazard, PIH, material. Part 1. Secure chain of custody. Shippers will physically inspect security-sensitive railcars prior to shipment. Freight railroad carriers will establish positive and secure handoff procedures for security-sensitive materials shipments at points of origin, delivery, and interchange. The chain of custody requirement applies to the transportation of any PIH shipment, certain explosive materials, and certain high-level radioactive material shipments, and covers receivers in the 46 key urban areas. Each freight rail carrier will initiate chain of custody documentation subject to subsequent audit by TSA inspectors. TSA has the authority to impose fines up to $10,000 per violation. Part 2. Communication. This rule requires freight and passenger railroad carriers, rail transit systems, and certain rail hazardous materials facilities to designate a rail security coordinator. The coordinator will serve as the liaison to DHS for intelligence information, security-related activities, and ongoing communications with TSA. Part 3. Reporting security concerns. This rule requires freight and passenger railroads to immediately report incidents, potential threats, and significant security concerns to TSA. Part 4. Location tracking. This rule requires freight railroad carriers and certain rail hazardous materials shippers and receivers, at the request of TSA, to report the location of individual security-sensitive materials cars within minutes, and the locations of all cars containing security-sensitive materials within 30 minutes. Part 5. Inspection Authority. This rule codifies TSA's authority to inspect freight and passenger railroad carriers, rail transit systems, and certain facilities that ship or receive hazardous material by rail. Proposed Measure Number 2, which implements security action items, is a voluntary agreement with the railroads and is comprised of 3 general areas: system security, access control, and en-route security. When we say en-route security, we're talking about a few different things simultaneously. First, developing site-specific security plans for operations in high-threat urban areas. The plans will address reducing the number of hours PIH cars are left unattended and not moving, reducing potential exposure to surrounding communities, and developing procedures for a secure chain of custody. Second, it would involve ceasing operations near public venues during a national special security event. Additionally, it would require protection for all PIH cars. Rail carriers will identify and select areas throughout their systems where cars containing PIH can be moved and held when threat conditions warrant. Finally, it would provide TSA with the necessary data to objectively measure the reduction of PIH car dwell time in high-threat urban areas. If you have a choice of these previously mentioned 2 security measures, which is better at reducing risk in the real world? Measure Number 1 was developed after the Madrid train bombing in 2004 and was put into effect on December 28, 2008. While Security Measure Number 2 was negotiated between TSA and the rail industry in July 2006 and implemented on November 21, 2006. We can evaluate these 2 sets of security measures by considering the security goal they work toward. That is, what is actually attempting to be accomplished. Also recall the fact that Measure Number 2 was implemented 2.5 years prior to Measure 1. The benefit of implementing some security 2+ years earlier buys down more terrorist risk than a series of potentially better security measures implemented over 2 years later. The reason why security action items worked effectively is because the security measures were broken down into their operating elements. The goal and its success accommodated a security need within the normal business practices of the railroad, and by changing the guidelines dictating where dispatchers stop trains, the measures could be implemented at no real cost to the railroad companies. In a sense, the measure delivered the desired security benefit almost as a byproduct. Additionally, dispatchers had it written into their job description to reduce the number of hours trains would sit unattended, also known as dwell time, with hazardous materials. By incorporating this level of accountability into the dispatcher's performance metrics, railroad operators had a real incentive to change company protocol in a way that would lower security risk considerably. From a baseline conducted in 2006, railroads committed to reduce by 25% the dwell time outside of the rail yard of PIH cars in high-threat urban areas, HTUA, within 1 year. At the end of the year, dwell time had been reduced by 40%. Working within the pre-existing railroad system, dispatchers were motivated more quickly and more effectively by their own performance measures to accomplish the security goals we wanted. There is a major distinction between the rulemaking and the security action item. The rulemaking item overlays on top of regular railroad processes with a separate set of new actions, i.e. training new people, TSA inspections, auditing, etc., and an entirely new paperwork process on both ends of creation and capture. Consider it a discussion with lawyers and lobbyists, one that can occur over a significant length of time. In contrast, the security action items had a granularity familiar to existing railroad operations. When TSA negotiated directly with railroad operators, the solution seamlessly integrated into the pre-existing system at a low cost. Rulemaking can be an effective process, but there are other additional options available to policymakers that may have a quicker and less costly outcome. Sometimes rolling up your sleeves and talking operator to operator in order to find an innovative way to integrate your security desires into the existing process is faster and more effective than simply showing up with a stack of paper and a handful of lawyers. What are some typical tools available to the government that have the ability to enact security measures within private companies? One tool is the role of inspector. The function of the inspector is based on how you decide to define the role. For instance, is their role to make sure paperwork is filled out correctly and audited for compliance? Or are they tasked with walking the rails with local management and crews looking for security improvements? Other tools include grant programs that pay for the implementation of security measures. At first glance, the idea of giving grants to railroad companies may not make much sense. Aren't railroad companies one of the most profitable sectors in the freight business? But it is an option, and one that is understandably palatable to private companies. When you work for the public safety industry, this kind of option can yield very desirable results. Alternately, a security directive, which is an order to take a very specific action, is usually saved for justified emergency situations. For instance, if there was a particular threat to chlorine tankers, armed guards might be temporarily required to post near chlorine tankers to protect them while in or outside the yard. Security directives are immediate and dramatic. Accordingly, they are used sparingly. As we think about risk in the freight rail sector, which do we actually consider to be the greatest risk? PIH leaks or an attack on the integrity of the entire rail network? Even the worst possible PIH leak would be temporary and limited. However, if the command and control system had a cyber attack, thereby stopping the operations of America's railroads, the effect could be catastrophic. For example, following a natural disaster, if rail cars are unable to bring chlorine into a city, water in that municipality would be undrinkable. Are we in fact looking at the right target? Should we be spending more time looking at the network and infrastructure rather than the occasional PIH leak? Clearly, they both have a place on our radar. What, then, is our key takeaway? How can we go about weighing and prioritizing these risks? We must find ways to blend operational and security requirements, implementing our solutions at the lowest cost. As a government official, you might have to do things differently than you originally anticipated. Thinking critically about policy requires looking beyond the traditional toolkit for dealing with private entities and attempting to align their commercial incentive with your security needs, but the upside can be very rewarding.